So by now you've seen the episode where we bought this old MR2 and lovingly restored it and fixed it up into a pretty decent looking car. But what you don't know is just how bad it actually was. In this episode I'll be talking about the bodywork. I'm going to show you just how bad it was and what I had to fix, and hopefully teach you something, because doing this kind of thing in your own garage isn't that difficult. You can take a car that's got some damage and for relatively little money fix it up. Now before we get stuck in, I have to say that bodywork is something that's quite intimidating. I myself personally have never done bodywork like this before, and I was surprised at how easy it was. That's why I want to share this with you. Of course, I'm very comfortable wrenching on engines and doing mechanical stuff, and the next episode will be about all the mechanical things that were fixed on the car. But for this one, I really wanted to share with you how simple it is. Anyone can fix this kind of thing. So let's look at the whole picture here. What is it that actually needed to be fixed? Very obviously we have to do the front fender and the door on the side where the car was hit. But something that we didn't realize is that there was a lot of work to be done on the roof as well. Some very bad patchy Bondo and rust and things like that were out of sight. Also underneath the hood, which is not really a hood slash bonnet, it's actually the trunk slash boot of the vehicle, there was a lot of rust. It was really falling apart, so I had to take care of that as well. So we're going to be focusing on these things in today's episode. And first, let's just do the obvious one. We have to get the fender, the busted fender and the busted door off of the car. So we couldn't get the door open. It was completely jammed. So it makes sense that we take off the front fender first. And the best way to do this is to just jack the car up and take off the front wheel there so that we can actually gain access to all the little bolts there in the wheel well. It's fairly straightforward. Just remember, whenever you're jacking up a car, put a jack stand underneath. I mean, be safe, at least put in a little bit of effort into being safe. And another little trick I like to do is to actually take the wheel that I've removed from the car and stick it under the car too, just as an added little, measure of safety. Now when it comes to actually unbolting the fender, it's super simple. All you need to do is follow the wheel well around and see where it's connected and just remove the bolts. There was something like maybe 10 bolts holding the thing on in total. And if you've worked with Lego or anything like that growing up, this kind of process is super simple. So just remove them all, make sure it's not catching on anything, and then you can pull the fender free. And there we go, the fender is now off of the car. So now we had to get the door off. And this thing was a real bear to get off, because what had happened was all of the internal components of the lock, all the rods, everything like that had been pinched and squeezed and basically were stuck in place. There was nowhere for them to move. That entire door was collapsed. So we couldn't open the door. None of the hinges worked. None of the handles worked. So I thought at first that I could try pry it off with this big crowbar slash pry bar. But after a time I realized that I'm probably going to end up doing more damage to the remainder of the body of the car if I kept this up. So I decided to tackle it from a different angle. I went to the front of the door, and although the hinges had already been unbolted by the previous owner, the door would not open. And it turns out because there's a little metal slider that goes there, which kind of controls how the door opens and closes and whatnot. It was held in by like a little cotter pin, which I managed to pry free. And then I could kind of open the door a little bit. But this, of course, didn't resolve my problem. The door was still latched shut. And I had to really think of another way to get this done. So I removed the door card, which was fairly straightforward. All you do is unclip the window winder and undo all the screws and it pops straight off. And then I went about trying to make enough room for the door lock mechanism to work again. So I just got a big chisel and a hammer and I started banging the door out so that I could actually get enough room to work. And eventually, after a lot of sweat and time and effort and swearing, the door came off. Now at this point you might be tempted to take this door and throw it off a cliff or throw it into the sea or something because it's giving you so much hassle. But don't do that, because there are things we might need to scavenge from the store. We might need the side mirror, the glass, any number of little switches or things that are still inside the door, so keep it. See this? I guess it didn't really survive the shipping very much. That's supposed to be straight.
Uh-oh.
Let's see what it looks like. I wonder what color it's going to be. That doesn't look great. It's a good thing we're respraying this, you know?
Shit.
Yeah. Diapers. Well, it's kind of appropriate since this is a piece of shit. There we go.
Are we any better off?
Well, yeah, look. This is bent too. So to say I was disappointed with this fender that we ordered would be an understatement. This thing was wrecked. I mean, just look at the front there. The nose of it is completely bent over. And more worryingly, this part where it had actually been bent and now it has this crease in it, which is actually very difficult to get out. You know, to be honest, it wasn't too difficult to get the front part fixed. All I took was a rubber mallet and kind of smacked it a few times and actually managed to get it back into shape, strangely enough. It was the other part that was really tough. Now, I suspect most of you won't have to deal with this because if you order a new fender or you go to a pick and pull or something, you'll be able to find a fender that doesn't have this issue. So you can pretty much skip this part. But if you're interested in how I fixed it, I actually, for the first time, used sort of metalworking tools. I ordered off Amazon. It's basically just a hammer and a dolly. It's called a dolly, that little piece of metal you hold behind. And then what you do is you basically smack on this and, you know, you can see the little dolly falling out there. But you basically just use that dolly behind and you smack it and you spread the metal that way. And eventually I managed to kind of get it into the correct shape and it looked fairly okay. But like I said, you probably won't need to do this. So once I was done playing with my dolly, I decided that I'd take the fender and line it up on the car to see if it actually fit. Once I was happy that everything kind of fit and it looked like it was the right shape, it was now time to actually make this thing look like the rest of the car. In other words, paint it. Now, this is the part that you're going to find interesting because it's a lot easier than you might think. Okay, so the first thing we want to do is just clean the thing before we get to work because it's just going to make your life a lot easier. I just used something called Crud Cutter that I picked up at, I think, Auto O'Reilly's or something like that. It works really well. You can use any kind of degreaser or any, soap and water works too. Just clean the thing off nicely. And then we're going to sand it. Now, if you've got a lot of time on your hands, go ahead and just get some sandpaper and do it by hand. But if you've got an electric sander, trust me, it makes your life a hell of a lot easier. I'm just using 80 grit sandpaper here because it's rough and I want to get rid of a lot of the paint and I want to make a nice surface for the paint to adhere to. So I just basically did the whole thing in 80 grit and sanded everything off. Now, this actually helped me a lot, especially with the area that I'd beaten out earlier. We call it panel beating for a reason, right? So it was looking a little rough, but after sanding it, it actually smoothed it all out, and I was actually very pleased with the result. So once I thought it was sanded enough and the surface looked good enough for paint to kind of stick to, remember you do want it to have a little bit of a key for the paint to stick to. So that's why we're removing the top layer of clear coat and stuff because it's a bit slippery and paint's not going to really stick to it. So now it's time for us to actually put primer on the thing. Now, don't skip out on primer. I know it's tempting to just lay some color paint on there and think you're done, but the primer is going to make sure that paint sticks on there and doesn't just scrape off easily. And the primer I used was just some Rustoleum professional primer, which I also just got on Amazon, real easy to get. And it worked really well. So what you want to do is get yourself a table to work on because if you're going to be bending down on the ground like I am, when I was sanding it and all that, you're really going to just start to hate yourself and, you're going to be like an old man and have to get a walking cane or something. So just get yourself a nice little table to work on. Make sure everything's clean because now you're getting to the point where you're going to be painting, so you don't want any dust and weird stuff everywhere. Once you've made sure you've gotten rid of all the sort of dust and contamination from your painting area, what you need to do next is use wax and grease remover, or in my case, just Crud Cutter, to once again wipe down the surface you're going to paint, just to make sure there's no dust or oil or anything there that's going to, stop the paint from sticking or get caught underneath the paint. And once you're satisfied, it's time for us to actually lay down the primer. Now, this is very easy. The only thing that you have to worry about is you have to worry about causing runs and clumps and big sort of, patches of unsightly primer. And the way to avoid this, it's very simple. Just make sure the can is moving before you actually press down on the spray nozzle. Don't hold it steady and then press and then start to move. And all you need to do is lay down an initial coat, which can just be very light, sort of just thrown on there. It doesn't need to look solid. And once that's down and dry, leave a little bit of time to dry between coats. Lay down the next coat and keep doing it until you're satisfied with the result. Alright, so now that the primer is down and looking good, we're going to leave it for a while to cure. And for the sake of expedience, let's just move on to the door. Now, this door was ridiculous. It looked like it had been pulled out of the Sahara Desert. It had sand in it, it had spiders, it had various wasps' nests, all sorts of things I had to clear out. Always be careful when working on these things, guys. Like, make sure you got gloves on and look, don't just stick your hand in something before you actually see what's inside.
First scorpions and now a brown frickin' widow.
Yeah, I'm just busy removing like some masking tape and I peel it off and this thing like literally crawls over my finger. So once it was clean, I did exactly the same as with the fender. I just sanded it down. One thing, don't forget to mask off the bits you don't want to paint over. So if you've got black trim and you want it to stay black, just get painter's tape or masking tape. You can pick it up at any hardware store. It's really cheap. Just put it down nicely before you start. Anyway, I sanded it down. I put primer on it. Everything's ready. And now we need to find the right kind of paint for our car. Now that's very easy. Most cars have the paint code or the name of the paint somewhere on a sticker under the hood or on the side of the door or somewhere in the car. A lot of interesting facts that you can find underneath the bonnet or hood of your car. For instance, this is all about catalysts and your timing and stuff. Don't worry about this. These are all your emissions. The hoses for the vacuum stuff. You got this is for your belts. We're going to get into all this in later videos, but what you want to look for is things like this, okay? Now if I go and run these numbers on the internet, this is probably the paint code for this vehicle. However, it's very easy to just look up online, type in the brand of your car and the color, because usually they only have one white or one black or one silver color for whatever year and model of your car. It's pretty easy to find out this kind of information online. Our car was Toyota Super White 2. And we could get cans of the exact paint that matches the color on Amazon. Super easy. So we just ordered a bunch of cans of this. And again, like the primer, what you want to do is just lay on an initial coat. It doesn't need to be very thick. And then let it dry a couple of minutes. And then go on and do the next one. And put down at least 3 layers of paint. Because if you can see that primer shining through still, you haven't put on enough paint. So just keep going until you're happy with it and satisfied, and then leave it. I suggest leaving it for like a day to cure nicely. Now you're going to have one of two results, and as you can see here with the fender, it came out fantastic. I'm very happy with the way the paint came out, and I didn't have to do anything further. But if your paint is a little rough, and it's very easy to feel, once it's dry, just run your hand over it, and if it feels like it's kind of sandpapery or, it's just not smooth, what you're going to have to do is sand it down. Now, that's not a big deal. Get yourself some 2000 grit sandpaper. We call it water paper because what you do is you dip it in water and you just slowly and carefully sand down the whole thing until it feels nice and smooth to the touch before you move on to the next step, which is the clear coat. Now with clear coat, you do want to get 2K clear coat. That's the only real stipulation. Again, you can just get it on Amazon. And with this stuff, your initial coat must be very light. So just put a very light sort of misting of a clear coat basically. And the second one, you can actually put it on a bit thicker. And again, probably something 2 to 3 layers is good enough. Just do it until you think it looks good enough. And then this one, rarely leave it to cure for a very long time. You don't want to mess with it. You don't want to touch it, because it's going to look terrible. So just leave it. I left it overnight and I was really happy with the results the next day. Now remember, don't go gung-ho with this paint. It does actually take a very long time before it really cures properly. I mean, we can put everything back on the car now, and that's what we did next, is just the reverse of taking this stuff off, put it back on. But I would suggest, if you can, leave the car parked in a garage for a couple of days, maybe a week or two. Or, if you're driving it, don't drive it in the rain. Don't take it to a car wash or anything, because you want the clear coat and you want the paint to really cure properly. But, after weeks of us driving the car around, we did take it through the rain, all of that. We washed it twice. The paint held up very well. It still looks perfect. Now, the door and the fender are back on, and yes, you saw I had a little bit of trouble getting it to fit and latch again, but that's because of the damage to the actual rear quarter panel there. And that's something for a different episode. We're going to actually look in depth on how to do all the Bondo work, because this was something I'd never done before. I had to do all sorts of things to make that work, so we're going to talk about that in another episode. But for now, let's move on to the roof, because this roof thing really bugged me. You see, the roof looked weird. It had like lumps in it, as if there was a rust spot underneath, or if it was dented or something. But as I got a little closer and tried to examine it a bit more, I gave a little tap with a hammer to see if it would go down, the bumps. I realized that this wasn't metal, this was actually Bondo. So out comes the grinder, and anyone who works on cars needs to have one of these things. I think maybe in America you guys call it a router or a router or something, but I call it a grinder, an angle grinder. And I just very lightly started to grind some of this stuff off, and it turned out to be quite a thick layer of Bondo. Now, there's nothing wrong with Bondo. Everybody uses it who does body work on cars, but there's a proper way to use it and there's an improper way to use it. So you don't want to be laying it on this thick, and you want to make sure it's nice and smooth. Anyway, I removed it all, ground it down, and I discovered that there was actually quite a lot of rust and big rust holes, and there was actually what looks like a bullet hole in the roof too. I don't know what that's all about, but I uncovered that. So I got rid of and treated all the rust before preparing it for Bondo. Now we're going to talk about Bondo in depth in the Bondo episode, because I don't want to get distracted here. I also did an antenna/aerial delete while I was at it. I made it look nice, and then I painted it in exactly the same way as I did the fenders. I sanded everything down, put primer on, and then put down the white paint, which was then followed by clear coat. Now, we all know that rust is the enemy of cars. It's the cancer of cars. Once rust starts taking hold, you can pretty much forget it. Your car is going to just continually be under attack. But there are ways of getting rid of it. Of course, the best way to get rid of rust is to cut it out and completely get rid of it, and then just weld in some new sheet metal or something like that. But let's be honest, that's not what we're doing here. That's not what Worthless Whips is all about. We want to teach people how to do things in their garage easily. So, I found another way that kind of works. And it's worked pretty well for me so far, and that is basically take a wire wheel, clean off the rusted area as much as possible. So try to just brush it all out of there. And once you've gotten rid of all the loose stuff and, it seems pretty okay, I use something called Rust Converter. Now, the one that I use that works the best so far is this Rustoleum Rust Converter. And you just spray it on pretty liberally. It stinks, by the way. Make sure you're in a ventilated area, because I feel like if you're breathing it in, you're varnishing your lungs or something. So be careful of this stuff. Spray it on, and then you leave it. And I normally leave it overnight, and by the time I come back the next day, it's actually converted the rust into this kind of black substance, which can then be sanded or machined, and it stops the spread of rust, which is fantastic. So, in all honesty, this trunk lid / hood lid / whatever you want to call it should be replaced. I mean, it's pretty far gone as far as the rust is concerned, but the important parts, which is where it connects to the hinges and of course the latch in the front, were still in great condition. So there's no danger of this thing suddenly coming loose and flying off the car or anything like that. So there's no reason not to use it still, other than the fact that it's got some pretty big rust holes around the side. I decided how I was going to tackle this was I would basically get rid of all the rust, like I mentioned before, and then I'm going to just undercoat the whole thing using like the rubberized undercoating that you put on the bottom of cars to stop rust. If you live in the north or something where they put salt on the roads, people put this stuff on their cars all the time. So I thought this will make it look a little better, and at the same time should prevent any more rust from forming here. And whoever owns this car can then drive around, and it'll continue to be like this for years to come. And if they really want to, they can just replace the whole lid for not that much money. And from the outside, it all looks perfectly fine anyway. So once I was done with the hood lid / trunk lid, it went back on the car. I did give it a coat of white paint as well, a slight sanding, a coat of white paint, and some clear coat, because there were a lot of rock chips and things on it. So that's why it looks so much better. I, of course, now had to install the badge. This is kind of the moment of truth. To me, this is the end of the bodywork. Everything else is ready, and I just need to put this on. So a little bit of double-sided tape, and man, that really completes the picture. So this is, of course, just part of what we did to fix up this car. Don't forget, we've got all the mechanical stuff coming in another episode. But if you want to see the whole process of us buying the car, fixing it up, and selling it, and of course testing it, and all our opinions of what we think about the car, don't forget to check out the main episode, which is, of course, linked below. Every single thing that we used in this episode, from tools to paint to cameras, you name it, it's all in the description. So if you're not sure of what it is you need to use if you want to do the same, don't worry, we've done all the work for you. Just go down into the description, you can find everything. If you want to be a big part of the show, go over to patreon.com/worthlesswhips, because you get to vote on which car we do next, and you also get a lot of behind the scenes, early access to our episodes, and very in-depth sort of detailed descriptions of what we're doing.
We'll see you guys on the next episode where Winston teaches you about all the mechanics in Bondo, and I hope to see you next time on the next Worthless Whips.